This episode is made possible by our Patreon supporters, Kim Hokinson, Bree Smith, Robin Brown, Cornelia Weiss, Janelise Cannon, Heather McKinnon, Jamie Legg, Maria Carla Sanchez, Valerie Jacobson, Amanda Gilmore, Michaela Frew, Jill Harrigan, Chantel Oliver, Lindsay Cummings, and Siobhan Keenan. You can become a patron for as little as $1 a month and help us make more episodes of the podcast. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Olivia.
A 6-year-old girl has just set out on an epic journey that will take her nearly 1,000 miles atop horses and camels and elephants.
Wow.
She will cross mountains and rivers, green plains and scorching deserts, meet new people, hear new languages, eat new food, see new sights, until she finally arrives at the brand new home of a brand new king, her father, the very first emperor of the brand new Mughal Empire.
Oh. Can I go?
Yeah, it is so much fun for me to imagine this bright, curious, vivacious little girl reveling in every second of this adventure of a lifetime.
Yeah. I've already scripted the whole Disney movie.
I love imagining her drinking it all in and making mental notes of everything she's seeing, storing it all away somewhere in the back of her mind so that someday, over 40 years later, she could write it all down for us to read.
Wonderful.
It is wonderful. It's absolutely glorious. And it is the perfect kickoff to the life of this incredibly fascinating, incredibly adventurous, incredibly unexpected hero, Princess Gulbadan Begum.
Ooh.
I'm Olivia Mickle.
And I'm Katie Nelson.
And this is What's Her Name?
Fascinating women you've never heard of.
Now, obviously, when I saw that returning guest, Dr. Ruby Lal, had a new book called Vagabond Princess about the life of Princess Gulbadan, I was so excited. My expectations were sky high, and it absolutely blew my mind. And I knew immediately that we had to bring Dr. Lal back to share the delightful and wildly unexpected story of this very, very unusual princess.
Yay!
My name is Ruby Lal. I teach South Asian history, focusing on mostly feminist ways of thinking history. And by that, I mean focusing on unexplored, unthought through, put into oblivion, what we call erased figures in history. I've been teaching in the American Academy now for 20 years. And since my last biography of the Mughal Empress Noor Jahan, I've fallen in love with this genre called biography, which has given me a lot of sleepless nights and lots of kind of wondrous takes. And I'm excited to speak about Vagabond Princess.
I think it's fair to say that Ruby Lal pretty much invented feminist early modern Indian history.
Oh.
I know it's a bold statement.
Sure is.
But I stand by it.
You're inviting emails.
My academic career actually began with Gulbadan's manuscript. So this was the 1990s. I was in India getting ready for graduate school. And I was one of the fewer number of people studying what was back then called medieval Indian history. Most people went and studied modern Indian history, which meant, the anti-colonial national struggle, independence of India, colonialism, and so on. I was very drawn to the Mughals, but the more I read, what piqued my interest was that there was really something called feminist history of the Mughal Empire. So I dived in, and In one of my searches in the lanes of Old Delhi, I came across the fantastic Victorian translator's book. Annette Beveridge was her name, and she had translated actually Gulbadan's biography by way of a long piece that she wrote, but also then Gulbadan's memoir in 1902. And so that was my first introduction to Gulbadan. Searching, exploring, thinking. Even in translation, I was struck. I was very taken. There was nothing of the kind I had read in history books. Most of these were authored by men and fantastic histories, but agrarian, economic histories, histories about production, about statistics, about administration, things like that. There were no women, no people, no ordinary beings in those histories. And Gulbadan's book, which is a mixture of memoir and history and memories in some ways, very hard, very unique to sort of classify, spoke of so many other realities. I was completely taken. And then I went to England and began my PhD in Oxford. And her book is housed in the British Library, classified as Oriental 166. And that's where my interest began. And diving into this work, I was able to bring out my first academic book, Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World, which many people have called the first feminist history of the Mughal Empire. So that's the relationship. It dates back ages ago. And I came to writing this biography 4 books down the line.
Ruby Lal knew Gulbadan before Gulbadan was cool, is what I'm saying. So, who is Princess Gulbadan? First, we probably need a little bit of context here. The Mughal Empire has just been launched by a very ambitious man named Babur, who has grown tired of this constant push and pull of neighboring kingdoms and warlords and never knowing when the next attack might come. So he decided to just take over everything. And then he wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. And thus begins the famed Mughal Empire, one of the wealthiest and most powerful and most influential empires in the history of the world. It would last 200 years, control something like 25% of the world's population.
Yeah.
But nobody knew that yet. As far as anybody knows, Gulbadan is just the 6-year-old daughter of the latest flash-in-the-pan conqueror to grab himself a chunk of the Indian subcontinent.
She was the daughter of the founding figure of the Mughals, Babur. She was born in Kabul, in a citadel. It's called Bala Hisar. That means that it was army encampment as well as the residential quarters. So she was born in the residential quarters above. And by this time, Babur had, fairly established himself. He was a descendant of Timur on the one hand and Genghis Khan on the other. And over generations, he and his kinsmen had struggled to retain the lands of their forefathers. So having lost, particularly the seat of Timur that he coveted in Central Asia called Samarkand, he had then eventually established himself in Afghanistan. But he was really looking across the river Hind to the territories of North India. And as Gulbadan actually was being born in 1523, he was away in India. And he then wins the seat of Delhi and then eventually Agra. And he sends invitations to multi-generation sections of his family in Kabul.
Come to Agra, everybody. You will not believe how gorgeous it is here, how easy it is to grow food, how nice the weather is. Leave the mountains of Kabul behind. We'll set up operations in Agra instead. So, 6-year-old Gulbadan is in that very first wave of royal immigrants who are forging a new path into what is now northern India.
She was 6 at the time in 1529, coming at the behest of her father in this caravan of 100 people. And she grows there till 17. And then her father dies, her brother Humayun ascends the throne.
And after just 5 years, the kingdom is lost to the Sultan of Hindustan. It's a pretty short empire. There's lots of drama, there's lots of intrigue, there's lots of betrayals within the family and the court. But finally, after 15 years of this, Humayun retakes the throne and the kingdom. And in 1555, the Mughal Empire restarts itself again. And Humayun rules triumphantly for a full 7 months before he dies and leaves the throne in the hands of his 14-year-old son, Akbar.
Akbar, there he is. The one in the history books. Akbar the Great.
Akbar the Great.
The one everyone talks about. Yeah.
He's going to be a big deal. Now, Akbar means great. So his name is
Great
the Great.
The greatest great.
Just for some added timeline context here for our listeners, Akbar will eventually have a son who will be named Jahangir, who will eventually become the 4th Mughal emperor and marry a fascinating widow woman named Nur Jahan, ... So that's where we are in comparison to the Nur Jahan timeline. Akbar is going to make some massive world-shifting changes, not just to the boundaries of the Mughal Empire, which he will expand by a huge amount, but to the culture and the norms and the life of the empire itself. Mughal rulers have always been itinerant. They are constantly moving, this massive courtly entourage, never spending more than a few months in one place. Akbar has decided it's time to change that. This transition from a completely itinerant mobile life to a more, not entirely, but more stationary, staying in one place kind of life is a pretty extraordinary shift. And it's not just about logistics or centers of power or practicalities. This is a profound spiritual and philosophical and aesthetic and social and psychological shift. Because itinerant life for the Mughals is not just about moving. The values, the experiences, the focuses, the intent of Mughal life are inextricably interwoven with the act of moving.
And Akbar begins to build in the 1570s the first imperial sandstone quarters. No more itinerant life. Up until this time, this kind of tent living in mud citadels, this was really part of the ethics of life. So this transition to stone living is new for generations like Gulbadan. Take Gulbadan's father, Babar, who's always moving, right? I mean, he's your king par excellence in wandering and wonderment. And he brings this out in his gorgeous recollections, that it's about people on the way, it's about the rivers, it's about the tribes. It's one of the most glorious catalogs of the time, of the era, of the geography. So she is his daughter, and she absolutely adores. One of her favorite moments that I bring out in her early coming to Agra is to see her father sitting and writing his memoirs. So while her own memoir is not like Babar's, she's like him in this ethic of wonderment. and this impishness. And this is really what I wanted to capture, is really to talk about movement and migration of the mind and the body, of what it does when people move. In fact, why is it so important to them? So I think no matter where she would be, she would always, this kind of sense of freedom. Another word that I lived with during the course of writing this book. How was she seeking this freedom? What did it mean to be free? It's not a given, right? The Mughals always remained itinerant. But from this time on, the movement had way more to do with, let's say, imperial campaigns, war, traveling to make assessments of hunting. But hunting was also not just hunting. During hunting campaigns, you took assessments of agriculture, the production, or the complaints of ordinary people. So those were the reasons why the kings or the dynasty continued to travel.
Ruby Law talks about this as moving from tent living to stone living. They're building stone structures to stay in, to return to repeatedly. But even these stone palaces are very heavily inflected with that spirit of movement, with that feeling of openness, the importance of facing out to the world, of being open to change, open to experience. I think the best example of this is Akbar builds this palace/city called Fatehpur Sikri. I had never heard of Fatehpur Sikri until I arrived at Fatehpur Sikri in 2012, probably. We rolled up to this fantastical, impossible, fairy tale city. These enormous sandstone structures, completely abandoned, perfectly well preserved. And in fact, you should look it up because I've never conceived of anything like this. Like, I will never forget those first few moments.
Wow. Fairy tale.
It's so hard to explain.
Looks like the ultimate sand castle.
Yeah, it's all red sandstone.
The color of sand.
Yeah. It's just kind of seems to have magically appeared out of the desert.
Onion domes, little spires, lots of columns, open airy space.
This is not a ruined city. It is
Yeah.
intact, and walls were not a priority. These are, as Ruby Law says, stone tents. They have kept the aesthetic, right? The itinerant aesthetic, and they have just transferred the architecture to something a little bit more durable.
Yeah.
It is largely gardens and open sandstone structures that will protect you from the sun, but have full air movement and be open to the world. It is like no place else I've ever been in the world.
It's been established by architecture historians and other experts that it actually replicates the sentiment of the tent. You know, the pavilions, the general layout. It's actually tons and tons of open spaces. It's not demarcated in the way we imagine public and private today.
This is not a court that shuts itself off. This is not a court that hides the monarch away. It's all open to the world. Except Akbar made another pretty big change. He decided that the best way to prove his own divinity and power and importance on the celestial scale of things was to make sure that the women of his family, the women of his court, were no longer visible to the rest of the world.
And the history of the building of the harem it's a sign of arrival of the dynasty. He's done massive conquests. They're established. He has to declare in kingly terms they're here to stay. So tons of cities are being built. So part of this thing of his own glory is that he wants to establish this harem. What it is this really important statement that Akbar wants to make about the grandeur of his empire. So just to be very, very clear, his aspiration is actually to elevate the women, right? That invisibility actually is a sign of sacredness and elevation, saying these are the women of this formidable king, and he wants to ensure that they are not seen by the ordinary, right?
The women of this family are so important and so special and divine and revered that the common people shouldn't even be allowed to look at them. Therefore, the solution is the harem.
Okay.
And this is the invention of this idea of enclosing women in a protective structure, literally and figuratively, socially, to hide the special important royal women from the eyes of the world.
The women are declared for the first time in the history of this empire. The Persian word is Bardegyan, which means the veiled ones, right?
But no matter what Akbar thought he was doing here, the result for Princess Gulbadan was absolutely stifling.
Yeah.
She is in her 40s. She is a woman who has spent her entire life traveling and exploring and having what can really only be described as adventures. She is the strongest carrier of what Ruby Law calls her father's ethic of wonderment. She is in love with the world, with the magic and the beauty of experiencing the world, with the spiritual ethic of this itinerant existence. And it's gotta be pretty irritating to have her young upstart nephew suddenly announce that she is now required to stay quietly at home.
Fascinating.
And live the rest of her life in
enclosed,
exalted seclusion.
Wow. That's about my age. After becoming an adventurer, I can't imagine then entering a harem.
My teenage child inform you that from now on, you live in your attic.
Yeah. What did she do?
The problem is she is also passionately devoted to the family, to the dynasty, to this power and influence that her family holds. There is no way that she would ever damage all of that by just openly flouting the emperor's decrees and running off somewhere without the approval of the court. She just could never do that. So what's a middle-aged vagabond princess to do?
Yeah, what?
Go on Hajj to Mecca, of course.
Oh, of course.
Yes, the time-honored tool of stifled and walled-in women everywhere. Pilgrimage.
And it's from here where my new biography opens. She decides to lead an all-women's pilgrimage to the Arabian cities.
An all-women's pilgrimage to Mecca.
Fantastic.
That has never happened. This is not a thing. This is the first women's pilgrimage to Mecca in the history of the Mughal Empire.
Cool.
And she has this negotiation with her nephew Akbar. She's, of course, living within the terms of this language that she knows. But I believe very strongly that it was also a way of exiting that life of confinement, however grandeur, however elevated and sacred. And he gives her permission to go for his own reasons. of establishment of his heightened glory as the great Islamic monarch. And then she leaves. So up until her leaving was what I had established in my first book, The Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World. I think there were two things that had always stayed with me after I had consulted her manuscript and, done all this work. One was that her manuscript stops mid-sentence on folio 83. And so that void had piqued my interest.
Wow.
The moment she's like, and then we decided to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca, it just, boom, gone. And the rest of the book is gone.
Ooh.
Why would her memoir suddenly stop at the moment that she is finally taking center stage in the narrative? Why is it gone? Who took
Who
it?
removed it?
Why would the section of the memoir focused on this groundbreaking and highly controversial women's pilgrimage be the part that oh so mysteriously goes missing? Was it removed? Is it just lost?
I see.
We can't learn from her own account of this pilgrimage because we don't have it. So what can we learn from the absence of that account?
Annette Beveridge noted this. She was very certain that Gulbadan will have written about her Hajj experience. Why wouldn't she? Was there something in those pages? We have to at least posit that question, right? I started paying attention to the fact that Gulbadan and the cluster Hajj of women that she leads stay in Arabia for 4 years. And that struck me as something very unusual. What were they doing for 4 years? So it is really these two facts, in a way. That's what got me very excited. And my idea was not just to write yet another biography. In this book, I've attempted to chart a life of this very unique person, but also as it is wound up in her writing, and this literary mystery that surrounds the missing pages.
And this is a perfect example of probably my favorite thing about Ruby Lal's writing and her work is that she never allows those tidy little single line hand waves that so often fill older history books to stand unchallenged. Then the women waited a year at the Red Sea to bargain with the Portuguese for safe passage. Wait, what? How? What? No, a year? What did that entail? Where were they staying? How were they bargaining with Portuguese pirates? And then she had 3 children. And then, no. Talk about that. I know there's a war to get to, but this is important. And then the princess led a 4-year-long women's Hajj to Mecca. How did she do it? Why did she do it? And most importantly, what was she doing there for 4 years?
Yeah.
When it comes to, it's not just women figures, it's unusual experiences that will, in a way, challenge the authoritative history. In those instances, we always get what I call bullet point history. 2-liners, 3-liners. Over these decades of writing and thinking, I go after those one-liners in the records. And there's always extraordinary stuff. I wanted to think, what did Hajj mean in the 16th century? Today we have these assumptions of, everybody dressed in 2-part clothing and doing all these observations. Yes, there are age-old practices that are done, but the landscape was different. And I got very obsessed about the ships. What kind of ships did they travel on? First generation Mughal ships. They are not modern ships, right? Then what were these journeys like? They were 11 women, royal women, tons of staff, other officers, an interpreter, all of these kinds of people. They were accompanied by a Hajj commander. But also it was the Mughal policy by this time, like most Muslim states at the time, to give free passes to pilgrims. So in the lower decks of the ship, lots of ordinary people would travel. When the Hajj commander sends a letter to Emperor Akbar, he mentions that at one point there was a little boy that fell off the ship, and it was the dead of the night, and for a very long time his cries could be heard. And they lowered a boat, and the boy was rescued.
But one of the things that they keep saying is they couldn't light a lantern to try to find him because they were afraid it would attract sea monsters. What sea monsters? What do sea monsters do? This is not backdrop.
Yeah.
This is the story.
It's the story. Yeah.
This
The
is
road movie.
history.
Yeah.
It gives you the world view, the thinking, the feeling of the people as they're traveling. How do they get to Mecca? What happens? Where do they stay? Literally for me, as I was leaving the west coast of India, I was really diving into the Ottoman records because at this time in Arabia, it's the Ottomans of Turkey who had roughly 60 years before Gulbadan's arrival. They had these territorial conquests, and they were really the protectors and servitors of the Holy Land. So she would be their guest.
So, what were these women doing for 4 years? Well, everyone has assumed that obviously they did 4 rounds of the Hajj. What else would they do?
So I dived in, and turned out less than a year into her arrival, Sultan Murad had issued an eviction order against the imperial women, which is housed in the National Archives in Turkey. In fact, 5 of those are there, which I read, with the help of Ottoman Turkish scholars. The reason of eviction orders was basically this. The history is tied to the fact that the ground upon which the Ottoman sultans built their sovereignty of Western Arabia and parts of Egypt at this time was to make a claim to say that they would be the protectors and servitors of all in the region. And that would include citizens, Bedouins, travelers, Hajj pilgrims, all of these kinds of people. So the year the women landed, 1577, was the year of acute grain shortages. And this was also a raw, sparse area. There were water shortages. And there's a word that Sultan Murad mentions in all of these orders. The word is called sadaqat or sadaqah, which means it's a form of giving. But the spirit of this word is really, it soaks in many different traditions of giving. And basically behind the spirit of the word is intense generosity. But it also means that when you give sadaqah to someone, it is not the recipient that's elevated. It is you who's elevated. All the eviction orders document Gulbadan and the women were distributing sadaqat in all sorts of places. In front of the great mosque of Mecca, in the Prophet city, Medina, various Persian cities. So all sorts of people. So Murad says, stop the dispersal of alms. Send them back, right? And he writes to big authorities like the Sharif of Mecca, who was the highest political religious authority in the region. 1577, they do not leave. 1578, they do not leave. 79, they do not leave. 80, they do not leave.
She just kind of goes, what you gonna do, make me? And for 4 years, she refuses to leave.
That's a long time to refuse to leave a place.
That is a long time. And lots of exploring and adventuring to do in those 4 years. Yes, we're doing the Hajj, but we're also living our best lives. And just that there's so many shades here to me of Marjorie Kemp, right?
Yeah.
Marjorie Kemp will follow this same plan of, this is a pilgrimage.
It's for God. You can't
It
stop
is my
me.
God-given right. Yes.
Yeah.
And also, I'm gonna have a wonderful time along the way.
Not a word in the Mughal documentation about this ongoing, basically, diplomatic crisis. One line in the imperial history, the Humayun-nama, noted that the women did not want to come back home. So that is an allusion to something of the senses of freedom. It's also that everybody will know, right? There were certain rituals in which, for example, the women had to run up and down from the great mosque to a particular mount and back. And the only entry and exit would be through the bazaar. So no matter how much people were spread out, they would know that these were the women of the harem of the great Mughal. And that would mean that it elevated Akbar the Great, right? So this is a sort of conflict of authority, in a way. Two Islamic monarchs, right, are being pitted, so to speak, against one another. The other word I want to talk about is the word that the Ottoman Sultan uses quite a lot, and that is what inspired the title of the book. But it also weaves in with what I was saying to you earlier on about this deep commitment to an itinerant mode. The word that he uses all the time is these mujaviran. And so an easy translation of it would be sojourners. But mujaviran were those people who had been frequenting these parts over a really long period of time. Amongst them were scholars, pilgrims, people went to study in these very important Islamic institutions of Islamic philosophy and thought. People admired architecture. So I got into that history of the Mujafiran. Who were these people who traveled? And so it was quite a struggle to find an English word. Translating, as we know, is not just finding an exact word. It's the tonality and a sense in another language. So to my mind, Vagabond captured that spirit.
Finally, the women agree to leave Arabia when the Mughal Emperor himself starts pretty firmly insisting, it is time to come home now. And they finally agree. This journey will require a rather dangerous bit of sailing through a particularly tricky bit of the Red Sea. Everything's going great. They're obediently headed home, and something went wrong. We don't know what went wrong, but in the words of the single line of acknowledgement of this event in Akbar's official court record, near Aden, most of the ships were wrecked.
Whoa. Wow.
Now, we can assume that the passengers were lowered into lifeboats and transported to the nearest shore. Given how infamous this particular patch of coastline was, we can assume that locals began salvage operations almost immediately. And we do know that Gulbadan and the rest of her cohort all survived and were eventually brought into the city of Aden, which is in modern-day Yemen, where they would remain for the next 7 months. Now, when I first heard this, this poor woman shipwrecked for 7 months on the way home. Aden is not like some remote desert island
Where they're waiting for rescue.
where no one could rescue these people. Aden is a pretty famous merchant center. It was supposedly founded by Alexander the Great. It is infamous, too. It is the location where Satan introduced the first wind instrument. So, there's that.
Cool.
It is reputed to sit near a gateway to hell.
Okay. Well.
So maybe not, the most auspicious place for a group of pious Muslim pilgrims to find themselves stranded. But it's a major educational center, and though it's, at this point, fairly politically unstable, they are not stuck in the middle of nowhere. Hints of their experience are pretty hard to come by. Akbar's official court chronicler did note that the governor of Aden did not behave properly.
Okay.
What that means exactly, we don't know. We know he should have been ensuring that the women had somewhere to stay, had safe passage through the area, should probably even have helped them secure passage home. We know that the Ottoman Sultan would have been extraordinarily annoyed to find these pesky Mughal women still on his hands when he thought he had finally evicted them. And his feelings may be filtering through the behavior of the governor here. So again, we have a bit of a mystery. Was this second very long delay in these women's return home the fault of the governor for failing to give them the help they needed to be on their way? Or is this yet another golden opportunity?
Governor. Yeah. Governor who understands, who says, sure, give out all your money to the poor here.
Or even just a handy scapegoat, right? Oh, yeah. Akbar, it was so terrible. We tried to come home, but they wouldn't help us at all, and we had to wait so long.
I have to admit to playing a card like that when I was in Turkey, because it's still such a patriarchy, so extremely patriarchal that I found it just all too easy to just be able to be like, I don't know, the man in charge of me told me to do this, and then they'd be like, oh, where is this man? And then I am off. Very easy card to play.
Yeah, I mean, it feels entirely possible to me that this was a very nice excuse for one last adventure before returning to the Sandstone Palace.
And then she comes back to Lahore. And after this kind of experience, or any experience, you do not return the same way. My own sense is that it's through that non-stop dispersal of arms that she finds a sense of freedom. And she's no more the same person. And it's 5 years after her coming back that Akbar issues this invitation. By this time, he's this formidable emperor, and he decides that it was time to document the history of his empire. And he invites several people to record their memories of their dynasty. There was only one woman amongst them, and that is Gulbadan. And that leads to the writing of this book, the memoir cum history, with which I began my career. So that's another journey she begins from the harem, a literary journey. It is unique in the Mughal archive.
Part history, part memoir, part biography, part hagiography, part sociology, part autobiography. And this is exactly the kind of history that you, Katie, would be delighted with. These are the kinds of details that you are always annoyed with other historians for not writing down.
It's unique in its documentation of that itinerant life. What did it mean to be on the road? What did tents look like? The fabrics, the textures, children dying in war, women being bartered, women arguing with men, being centrally involved in the project of the empire. And so she tells you in this moment, really, what is it like?
The unimportant details that are happening to unimportant people, not just the wars and doings of great men.
She invented social history centuries before we would invent social history.
Yep. Which is probably a large part of why so many men have poo-pooed this book for so long.
She's showing you the making of what we think as the Mughal Empire, right? That grandeur, that Taj Mahal, the diamonds, they come much later on. So it's an unclassifiable genre. She calls it Ahwal-e Humayun Badshah. That is the conditions in the time of Humayun. This was a favored brother, the second Mughal emperor, but of course she begins with her father. And conditions is a really interesting choice of words, right? I mean, she's not saying history, she's not saying baqiyats, the episodes. There's an openness she's suggesting here. I like to think of her as a critic. She's deeply invested in the project of the empire, without question. I think there is a visceral reaction we have when we hear the word critic. We often think it's criticism. But in my mind, critic is somebody who deeply cares, and she deeply cared. So you want to get into the throes of things, right? Debate, argue, work it out, and take the steps necessary that you need to. So she's both a witness as well as a writer, experiences all these things. There was nobody like that. Definitely the best witness he could have had. She is lovely.
One of the things I find the most fascinating about Gulbadan is she is the bridge. She is the bridge between the old world and the new, the old ways and the new ways, the itinerant adventure lifestyle and the secluded sacred harem. And he understands how hard this is for her, I'm sure. He knows what a shift this is. That, yes, these are the rules. And yes, this is the way that we're going to prove that we are the divine authority on Earth. But also, Auntie Gulbadan is going to be Auntie Gulbadan, and I'm not really going to stop her.
There was a great dismissal of her memoir, actually, when I was a graduate student. There was a notice of this memoir in one little footnote saying, this is a woman's little book. And
a little woman wrote a little book. Bless her heart.
And actually, Annette Beveridge, who translated this book in 1902, was facing actually very similar sorts of pushback initially, and then there was great reception. And then the book was lost.
There is basically no scholarly interest in this book at all through the 19th and most of the 20th century, which is absurd.
So I actually made an argument to my publishers that we should reprint Annette Beveridge's translation. Although it's a very Victorian translation, it's a really important translation, along with a very big biographical sketch of Annette's work on this manuscript that I've done now. So we're going to bring that out.
So people will soon be able to get their hands on a copy of this translation.
Oh, wonderful.
And everyone can have as much fun as I have romping through this incredible, unique book.
Annette, of course, had a very different trajectory. She went to India at age 30. She lived there for 2 decades. She married and birthed her children there. She had, it's kind of classic Victorian response at that time, very fraught, let's say, relationship with India.
It's almost this kind of meta-layered commentary on the whole recurring meta-historical problem here. That a mere woman wrote a book, so it's not important. But that means a mere woman is allowed to translate that book.
Yeah. For other ladies.
Yes. So obviously the translation is not important. But I do think that means we have, obviously, It is a British Victorian white lady's translation. And it is very British Victorian white lady translation. But I have to think that this is a much more true to the spirit of the thing translation than a Victorian English white man would have given us at that time. These details of fabric and clothing and children's lives and relationships are the things that get left out in most Victorian men's translations of things. So I'm grateful, in a weird way, that nobody thought it was important enough to let a man take a crack at it.
And that's another history. That's all history, yes. Not all history, actually, continuing history. I don't think of the history that I do as supplemental history. It's not just inserting women into history. I believe that ignored or erased figures actually shape-shifts history. It is not a matter of adding on.
You're not just sliding women in the background to fill out the existing history. Putting women in history changes the history because they're history and it's been wrong without them. This taps into a very key strategy that Ruby Lal and I talked about, how important it is to get these women's stories into the history early. If children grow up with women included in the story, then they expect women to be included in the story.
Yeah.
That, as we have very controversially asserted, what if women were there the whole time? In a few months, a new young adult edition of Ruby Lal's biography of Noor Jahan will be released, called Tiger Slayer. Oh, I'm so excited about this book.
This is the reason why I decided to do the young adult version. I mean, it's vital. That's the way of not only restoring and animating history, but really producing citizens within the terms, histories that have been erased. It's extraordinary that we have only one copy of Gulbadan's manuscript. It was a tradition in the atelier to make more than one copy. And when Annette is wrapping up her translation, her husband, Henry Beveridge, actually spent 7 months in various parts of North India, just skimming through every catalogue, every conversation he could do. Never found anything. And obviously, you're not going to find the sort of evidence that says that Akbar and his chronicler hereby note that we are going to not make more copies of the... I mean, you're not going to have that. Every important manuscript, there should be more than one copy. So we have to sit and think. I'm interested not in establishing what happened, because I think you cannot in that way, but really in the layers of action that surround this manuscript. So I think it is for us to imagine what may have happened.
I guess we can be grateful it exists.
We can be thrilled that we have any of it, but
that it survived.
But it does seem pretty sus.
Yeah.
So, in the end, it's a delicious mystery.
I love those.
Was the part of the book just lost? Was it destroyed? Who destroyed it? When? Why? Were there other copies made and they were destroyed later? If no copies were made, why not? What did she write that was so...
Oh my gosh.
Whatever it was, that it apparently had to be destroyed.
This is a multi-timeline historical novel begging to be written.
Absolutely. Oh, that would be brilliant. Someone assemble a team of brilliant novelists. Do that, please. Finish the story in all the possible ways.
I think this is what has driven me for a long time. The sort of uncanny way in which subjects will really demand that they be written about.
Huge thanks to Dr. Ruby Lal. On our website at what'shernamepodcast.com, you can find links, photos, and more. Music for this episode was provided by Farya Faraji, These Jammy Jams, Doug Maxwell, Aashish Khan, Pranesh Khan, and Shiraz Ali Khan.
Our theme song was composed and performed by Daniel Foster Smith.
Our intern is Katie Boucher.
What's Her Name is produced by Olivia Mickle and Katie Nelson, and this episode was edited by Olivia Mickle.